All right, thanks. I'm pretty sure the microphone works, right? Well, first of all, I'm actually not so pleased to be speaking because it comes at the expense of our regional coordinator and our other PIs from West Africa who weren't able to join us today due to visa issues. I'm sure everybody in the room has a story about visas that's been working in other countries. So they wanted me to give my best wishes to everyone and their regrets that they weren't able to participate. Um, but while I'm up here and giving the talk, and then I'll also try to triage questions that you have about different aspects to the right people, I did want to point out the collaborations with Nigerian universities, OAU and OSU, with Benin University's University of Parakou, and then also with University of Manitoba, who will be speaking on some of our value-added and food fortification stuff later on. I guess this doesn't work. So, uh, food production in sub-Saharan West Africa is the only place in the world where production per capita is decreasing, and that is primarily because the population growth is about 3.5% a year, and the increase in agricultural productivity is only about 1.5%. One of the major limitations to food production in this region is access and availability of fertilizer nutrients. And so our project, when we were funded through the first phase of the CIFSRF, was looking at integrating nutrient management and water management to try to improve food security of cereal crops in sub-Saharan West Africa. And then for the second phase, we've joined with partners in Nigeria who had been doing agronomic research and value chain and marketing of indigenous vegetables, underutilized indigenous vegetables. And so we put these two things together to try to come up with an agricultural package to really improve the performance of vegetable agriculture in this part of the world. So one of the main guiding rationales for investing in agriculture in West Africa is that it just makes a good financial sense. For $135, you get the same amount of food security work as $800 if you buy the food and just give it away. And not only that, you're building a sustainable infrastructure. And so there's a lot of good reasons to do this, just from the standpoint of being efficient with research funding, but then it also is from a global market or from a global national security standpoint sensible, because many African countries, their GDP and the stability of their economies are very closely tied to food security and to climate. And so one of the guiding principles of our project is to try to not only do things that are going to improve agriculture, are going to improve profitability today, but also to be cognizant that as climate changes and as climate becomes more variable, that we need to be able to equip the project to respond to those things. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So when the vegetables that we're working on in this project are primarily leafy vegetables, they are nutritious and delicious, and they're eaten and consumed both by smallholder farmers in their homes, but also they're sold in markets and are consumed on a wider scale. And so the economic value of these crops is actually quite high compared to cereals, which I'm more familiar working with in the region. And surprisingly, there's very few agronomic production recommendations. These are traditional vegetables that haven't really been subjected to modern agricultural improvements. So what our project's really doing is combining efficient use of fertilizers, what we call fertilizer microdosing, with also irrigation to provide the adequate water and nutrients to 4 different traditional leafy vegetables. So these are things like fluted pumpkin, African eggplant, and amaranth, that their fruit is also eaten and consumed, but you can periodically harvest their leaves and eat those as a nutritious side dish. And so rather than only have productivity when the vegetables come to maturation, you have a continued source of income as you're harvesting the leaves. And this also gives you the opportunity to periodically put fertilizer back into the soil and microdose those so that you get the optimal productivity. So I'm talking about microdosing, like all of you guys are familiar with it, but I like to share it as the idea of low-tech precision agriculture. It's nutrient stewardship. Rather than broadcasting fertilizer on the soil, which is very inefficient, it involves the strategic placement of the fertilizer into the soil at the right distance from the plant after it emerges and after there's been rain. And what we find in cereals is that typically doubles the yields compared to a control. And when we're talking about a microdose rate, it's about 1/4 of what we would apply in Western Canada for a cereal crop. And what you see is the recommendations are usually about twice as much fertilizer that you broadcast, and microdosing is even more productive compared to that. So the efficiencies are there. It's largely been untested in other crops, and so I'll show you guys some results from vegetables in microdosing. One drawback of this is that it's incredibly labor intensive. You could imagine to have to dig small holes and put fertilizer into the ground by hand, and so it's a bridge or a gateway technology towards more profitable agriculture. It's just the first step in fertility management. But it's simple, it provides a high yield increase, it's inexpensive, and it's conservative to fertilizer. So it's a good first step at improving agriculture. And in our project, what we actually saw was that you could increase the yields of typical leafy vegetables by about 50% compared to the local practice, which was just using manures. So this would be manure in the seed bed and then a microdose periodically added as well. You could see that for every naira that you spent on fertilizer, you would get returns of 4.5 to 6.25 naira of profits in Nigeria. So it's certainly economically a reasonable thing to do. And then in terms of water usage and water irrigation, for every millimeter of water that you added, you would typically see a fairly large increase in the yields of these plants as well. So from an agricultural standpoint or an agronomic standpoint, there's certainly a lot of gains to be made. Anecdotally, when we were doing site visits this spring, I was told that we're putting into the ground about 1/5 as much fertilizer as was traditionally broadcast in some of these vegetables in the Lagos area of Nigeria, and we're getting the same yields. So that kind of 5-fold increase in fertilizer use efficiency certainly is attractive. And that has the potential then, with the same volume of fertilizer, to get much better yields. You're going to increase the profitability, but that's going to also increase the demand for fertilizer, which is going to cause infrastructure to develop to be able to get increasing amounts of nutrients to farmers. Now, so the idea of agricultural production of vegetables then I think makes sense from an agricultural standpoint, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be effective when you think about the entire system. And so what our research group has been doing is looking at the idea of the innovation platform as our model for scaling up. And what the innovation platform is you look at the value chain and you look at who those actors are in that value chain, and you put them all in a room together. Rather than trying to tell them what to do, you ask them what their challenges are, and you collectively come up with ways to solve those problems. And in our case, these could be people who are selling fertilizer, selling seeds. If their problem is they don't have any seeds to sell, then they have to come up with ways to get good seed production and good quality seeds. It's the farmers who may need some of that agronomic recommendations that we've had in their local dialects, transporters and marketers, the food processors, researchers. We are potentially in that innovation platform, but not necessarily. A lot of this, if you're going to make it scalable, comes from NGO partners rather than from the researchers directly. And then as it starts to scale, as it becomes larger and more widespread, then either local or regional or federal agencies of the government get involved as well. But from a research standpoint, this is interesting because you don't always know what you're going to be studying or what you're going to be providing or what you're going to be doing until the platform collectively tells you what you're going to do. So you have to be pretty flexible. But one thing that we we did really want to focus on at all levels or from the very beginning is to bring women's groups into it and to focus on improving the situation for women farmers particularly. So what was pretty clear from talking to farmers was that they could grow more vegetables, but they had to have more markets, that they were only going to produce as much as they could sell at a reasonable rate, which is not a huge surprise. So one of the major challenges with leafy vegetables is that they're very perishable. We've been working on several different low-cost options, evaporative cooling to try to preserve the vegetables or fruits and vegetable products for longer periods of time, oven drying them to produce a powder that you could then fortify or use for breads and flour and things, and also solar drying these so that you, this is on the right, here, a solar-based or sun-based drying system where you're pulling water out of the leaves and preserving them so that they can be good as food for longer. And we'll participate in one of the panels later on, and we'll talk about more of this stuff. Just as a quick example, though. If you do have these flours or these powders, then you can start to incorporate them into foods, do sort of suitability, or basically make sure that they taste right, and you can start to fortify or improve the nutrition by adding these vegetables to things that people are going to eat anyway. And then on top of that, one of the main positive aspects of these indigenous vegetables is that they have antioxidant properties. And so in particular, they're very rich in polyphenols. And so if you can come up with ways to just extract those antioxidants from the vegetable, then you can start to fortify them in things like juices or beer or whatever, and mostly beer. And that's going to further drive demand. And So we think that we've responded to some of the requests from the farmers, some of the requests from the marketers in some ways that are going to be quite effective. The other thing, which is a little more near and dear to my heart, is how do you scale up research data points, or how do you take a trial or an experiment that you've done in one place and make it useful or make it valuable more broadly? How do you increase the inference space of a limited amount of research money? And in the case of our project, everything that we measured in our baseline survey, all of the research that we've done in the field has always been geo-referenced. And today we have good access to geographical GIS-based systems, so we can put our sites onto the map of the Earth and pull out things like not just soil maps, which is what's over there, which is of course the most important thing to a soil scientist, but precipitation, average temperature, permanent and ephemeral water, and elevation and population densities, access to highways, which all of these things could have implications for markets. And then we can also look at what the local language that's spoken in those places. And then when you have a research finding that was typical of this is how you grow the crop here, and this is the ideal conditions to be profitable, and it turns out that in this location it's very similar, those physical conditions are similar, then you can do that translation and you can scale it up or scale it out rather than having to, at every single site that you might want to study, start from scratch to do all the agricultural work. And this also gives us the possibility to start to run different climate change scenarios. If 20 years from now it's 3 degrees Celsius hotter, well, what does that imply for these sorts of village scale or regional scale systems that we're rolling out? Still doesn't work. And just as an example of that, vegetable production is very seasonal, and as I mentioned, it's largely due to, it largely requires irrigation to be really successful. And so you can look at, based on our water use efficiencies, or based on the water demands that we've calculated for the plants, you can compare that to the precipitation and the surface waters, and you can kind of get an idea about where your system might be in terms of water deficits. And so this is in the rainy season in Benin and Nigeria, and then as soon as you switch to the dry season, then you can see that the availability of water is a much bigger concern. And so the profitability, if one of the main things that's a limitation is access to good quality water, then you may be more effective at scaling up or scaling out in particular districts or particular regions. And we can base that to some extent on GIS. Along with the research that was going on at the university level, there's also a big push to try to increase the knowledge base and also the profile of vegetable production and vegetable consumption in the schools. In Benin, a lot of our agricultural experiments that are providing those recommendations to farmers actually come from what's a sort of a diploma level schools of agronomy that are available in the regions that we are working. And so we can, as part of those students' diploma level training, they're doing the research trials, and they also get the opportunities to devise other experiments and to test hypotheses that relate to the vegetable production. And so as an example, they started doing also microdosing of the animal manures in some of these locations, which is very similar to banned application of solid cattle manure, liquid hog manure that we do here, but it was something that was just first tried by them as well. If you're microdosing inorganic fertilizers, why don't you try also microdosing the organics? And so, you know, we talked to just one of these diploma level faculty or schools in Benin, and they had, I think, 3 of their parents were trying vegetable production under this kind of system after hearing their successes at the school, which is cool. In Nigeria, this is taking place more in the secondary school level, where they've set up young vegetable scientist clubs. They find an area near the school where they can actually grow vegetables. We have the training manual to help them learn how to do the microdosing as well as the vegetable production. And they are selling the produce from that back to their cafeteria, and then eventually as it scales up to local markets. So this is going to certainly raise awareness, but it's also a good opportunity from an educational standpoint. Another thing that's sort of ancillary is when you work with NGOs and you get integrated in some of their other projects that they have going on, you start to see how important that sustainability or water resource management is to areas like West Africa. On the far left here, they start with clean water that they're raising fish in, and this is a fish hatchery. And then the fish go into relatively clean water, and then as they get larger, they produce fish waste, and then they are also growing lilies and things to try to clean that up. As the fish get bigger and bigger, they eventually sell them as protein, and the nutrient-rich waters go to become irrigation water for vegetable production. And so that entire system then is getting really the most use out of the water that they can. And so these kind of integrated approaches are going to even raise the profitability more. And I would point out that these sort of urban agriculture for vegetables are not really very different than the ones that we saw at the University of Saskatchewan this year on top of a lot of our rooftops. And so I think that it's sort of interesting parallels there. Now, finally, one of the other things that we're working on with here in our project or with our team is the idea that it's great to scale things up and to come up with the best the best approach and move forward, but you want to go back and validate to verify that, first of all, you haven't done anything wrong from an environmental standpoint or from an agricultural standpoint, but also to evaluate what the scaling up process or what your interventions have actually achieved back at the village scale, back at the individual farmer scale, right? And so we, if I want to sort of highlight some of the stuff that we've done, I mean, it starts with actually doing baseline surveys and socioeconomic surveys and village level discussions with farmers, with collecting soil samples. I know synchrotron scientists is often called a suitcase science. In this case, it's an actual suitcase that they ship the soil samples in, doing advanced measurements, kind of look at what is the changes that we're making in agricultural practices, how are they changing the quality of soils with the Canadian light source synchrotron. From that, being able to take sort of evidence-based approaches back to our maps and then see if whether what we have predicted would happen in that map is actually valid back in the field. So it's scaling up doesn't only move bigger and bigger and bigger. You have to be able to go back and actually verify that some of the things that you've done are sensible, right? Or that they're real. So then in conclusion, or in summary, I guess, I would say that we're making good progress on improving vegetable agriculture in Nigeria and in Benin, that the innovation platform has a lot of advantages, but it also is very difficult to implement. So we may have been a little bit optimistic about how far that we could get in 3 years, but if nothing else, I think that we're now seeing where we really can bring in new actors or new research directions and be effective in solving people's problems. And particularly, it's not an agricultural problem anymore. I think it's largely market problems and market challenges. And so I think if we can improve the profitability and the demand for vegetables, then the farmer livelihoods and the farmer profitability is gonna follow. So at the end, again, I'd like to thank IDRC for funding this research, and all of the research partners in West Africa and here for actually doing it. While I get to stand up here and talk, then all the hard work actually happens behind the scenes, right? So if you guys have questions, then I'm happy to answer them.